So Seiji went home, and you can imagine how he felt. The thing was, about a week later, the matchmaker was looking over her records, and for some reason she came across the name of Kazuko and Seiji about the same time. And she thought for a moment, then called Seiji back and said, "All right, I have found one woman that maybe, just maybe, would marry you. The one woman in the country. I'll give it a chance if you will." And he said, "Please, please do." And then she called Kazuko back and said, "You know what? I may have found the one man in this country that may marry you. If you're very lucky, he'll say yes. Would you like to try?" She said yes. In the tradition of Japan, they met 3 times for an hour each. Both were so scared they did not say a word in either. After the 3rd meeting, the matchmaker went to them and said, "Okay, so what's going on?" Seiji said, "I was just too afraid to ask her. I mean, what if she says no?" And Kazuko said, "I didn't really want to say anything. What if he doesn't like me and won't want to marry me?" And the matchmaker said, "All right, I've heard enough. We're going to talk to the families. We're going to arrange this." A marriage was arranged, but before they were married, the matchmaker met with them both. And she looked at them and she said, "Seiji, look at Kazuko. And I'm going to tell you, right here is the one woman who is going to marry you, the one woman in this country. Kazuko, this is the one man who will ever marry you. So let me tell you, you better make this work, because this is it." They were married, and after all the guests left, they found themselves sitting alone in a room together for the first time. And in Japanese style, they were sitting on the ground. There was a long silence that stretched between them. And finally, Seiji looked at Kazuko and slowly bowed and put his head all the way to the floor, and then raised and said, "Thank you for marrying me." And then Kazuko slowly bowed and put her head to the ground and slowly raised her head and said, "Thank you for marrying me." Those were the first words that they said to each other. The next morning, Kazuko got up, and being a good Japanese wife, she made her husband breakfast. He was already up when she had finished, and so she slid back the door, knelt down on the floor, and he was on the floor too. And before she pushed his breakfast tray to him, she pushed it to the side and leaned forward again, put her head all the way to the floor, and said, "Thank you for marrying me." And her husband also bent over, put his head to the floor, and said, "Thank you for marrying me." This became a little ritual between them. Every night before they went to bed, they would both bow to each other and thank the other for marrying them. And every morning, when they got out of bed, the first thing they would do would bow to each other and ask to marry them, to thank them for marrying them. Now, the fact of the matter was, like all marriages, it was a lot of work. After all, they hadn't really known each other at all. Kazuko, having grown up in the poverty after the war, was very afraid of spending any money at all. It terrified her. Seiji was a very ambitious young man, though. He began to study Chinese herbal medicine and slowly began to sell it out of their apartment. Slowly it expanded to the point where they were able to buy a little storefront house. And he began to sell not only Chinese herbal medicine, but Western medication too. He became respected in the community. But as they expanded, every time they would expand, Kazuko would get terrified. Spending the money always scared her. I got to know them after they had been married for about 25 years. At that point, they had 3 children. 2 boys who were teenagers and a girl who was in college. And as I was having dinner with them, Seiji sort of stopped and said, "Oh, by the way, Kazuko, I probably should tell you that I got a really good deal on a new case for the store." And she said, "How much is it?" And as luck would have it, just at that moment, 2 workmen knocked on the door and said, "We've got your case, sir," and brought it in. And Kazuko said, "You bought this without asking me?" And he said, "It was a really good deal and I had to act quickly." Well, at that point, Kazuko got up and left. I had to go into the kitchen a few minutes later to get some more tea. And there was Kazuko with her back to me at the sink chopping vegetables. And when I say chopping vegetables, I mean chopping vegetables. Like, I'll tell you, at that moment, I was really glad I wasn't a vegetable. Her daughter came in and saw what was happening and put her hand on her mother's shoulder and said, "Mom, are you okay?" And her mother just kept going. And then she said, "Your father just makes me so angry at times." But then, you know, she stopped, put down her knife, and kind of leaned on the counter and said, "But I am so grateful that he married me." For 52 years, they ended every day and began every day with that statement. And sometimes I would watch them as they walked along the beach. Traditionally, Japanese couples walk with the man walking in front and the woman walking behind, but they reached the point where they would walk side by side. And even though it would have been scandalous for them actually to hold hands, occasionally their hands would brush each other, and they would stop, and you could see, and they would sort of smile at each other. There was real love there, and at one point, I asked Seiji about that. I said, you seem so close to your wife. And he said, "Yes." And I said, "How did you do that?" And he said, "Well, it sure isn't because we agree about everything." But he said, "You know what it is? I think it's because we have forgiven each other so much. Because we know that whatever we do, the other will forgive us. Because we just are so grateful to the other person for having married us." I said that they did this for 52 years, but that's not quite true. Because for the last couple of years, Kazuko began to lose her memory. And little by little, as she got older, she had a harder time doing one thing after another. And Seiji would help her first to get dressed, and then he would help feeding her. It reached the point, though, that she didn't even recognize her own children. It even reached the point where she didn't recognize her husband. At that point, she could no longer sit up and was in bed constantly. And Seiji would sit with her for hour after hour. And it was clear that she didn't really know that he was there at all. But the really remarkable thing was that every once in a while, he'd lean forward and he'd say, "I am so grateful that you married me." And whenever he said that, her eyes would immediately open, and she'd say, "I am so grateful that you married me." There came a point when she couldn't even say that. But as it turned out, just as that was the first thing that she had ever said to him, it turned out to be the last thing she ever said to him. We are so grateful for the people who we have in our lives who are there with us, for us. We should be so grateful for those sisters, those brothers, those children, those parents, those husbands, and those wives who are there for us. Because they're the ones that we live out the gospel with. They're the ones that we practice. They're the ones that teach us how to be peacemakers, how to control our anger, how to be humble and generous. And if we are going to fail at that, it is with them that we will fail. And they're the ones who we know will forgive us. So let me make a little suggestion for the week ahead. For those of you who are children, think about maybe saying to your parents, "Thank you for being my parents." And for those of you who are parents, think of saying to your children, "Thank you for being my children." For brothers and sisters, thank them for being there as your brothers and sisters. And most especially of all, for those of you who are married, in the week ahead, yes, it's not easy, is it? You know where I'm going with this. In the week ahead, look at them and say, "Thank you